Before we get into this podcast, I do want to quickly address some fears that are floating around right now with a possibility of a nuclear World War III. I do think the vast majority of this audience knows biblical prophecy well enough to know what I'm about to say. What is happening right now in Ukraine is not going to lead to an intercontinental nuclear World War III. While the Bible does not speak of anything related to Ukraine, we know that Russia will be a major player in Gog-Magog, which is just around the corner. While events in Ukraine may still escalate more, maybe even to the point of a limited low-yield nuclear weapon being used there, it either comes to an end or at least turns into a very low-intensity standoff, something like what we see on the Korean Peninsula. We know from the Bible that tribulation will not start with humanity on the brink of extinction because of a global nuclear war. Remember, Jesus warned us of wars and rumors of wars, but at the point of the rapture, people will be eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and so on. I know you're probably not worried about that, but I did want to address it, because there is a lot of talk about that right now. In this podcast, I want to talk about the global government. I've spoken about this in recent podcasts, but I want to put a finer point on it because I believe we are going to see some major developments with this in the coming months. In the book of Daniel, we're told about a statue, along with beasts, that are related to this statue. The statue is the 5 major world powers that will arise during the time of man's rule on the planet. The beasts are details about these world powers. As you look at the statue, the Bible tells us in Daniel chapter 2 the parts of the statue and the powers they represent. And of course in the book of Revelation, we learn about the 5th and final power. The 2 legs of Rome represent the splitting of the Roman Empire, which we now know happened in 395 AD when Rome split into the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The feet that later comes out of the legs is the final world power, which is a direct outgrowth of the old Roman Empire. Just like the old Roman Empire, the new one will start in Europe as one empire, but later split into 2. Now you may be tempted to think that this will be a split between Europe and America, which is the physical Babylon of tribulation. But it is not. The Bible tells us what the split will be and when it will happen. The split will occur at the midpoint of tribulation, and will happen when the Antichrist moves the capital of this global government from Europe to Jerusalem. We've been watching the slow build toward this final empire since the start of God's prophetic clock in 1948, but it's been like watching fingernails grow. You know they are growing, but it's happening so slowly that you don't see it simply by staring at them. However, this slowness is at an end as the prophetic clock is down to its last minutes. The Pact for the Future, which was just adopted by the UN a little over a month ago now, makes the UN the global government. If you haven't seen podcast 142, please watch it. It's a deep dive into this pact and what all it does. In this podcast, I'm picking up where it leaves off. I'm going to play about an 8-minute clip of a podcast. This is not from episode 142, but it does build on it because we are going somewhere with this. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, the UN cannot remain in America.
Mark Henry, you're very aware of this Summit of the Future. This was back around September 22nd. I think it was probably unnoticed by most Americans. The Biden-Harris administration adopted the United Nations Pact for the Future to transform global governance. When you hear the term global governance, Revelation 13, are we out of line to think that way?
Jan, I've got that document sitting right here. I think it's like 69 pages or so. I'm holding it right in front of you right now. And as you read down through there, that term keeps coming up. There are those terms, global governance. But really what they mean is a global government. There's a number of elements to that, but the bottom line is this. They want to give full authority to the UN, to the secretary, whoever that may be, an elected official, to declare an emergency based on whatever he feels with unlimited time frame over the whole world. That would definitely fit into Revelation 13. And could this be how Satan, in the providence of God allows it, global governments to take place in that way? Very possible, Jan. It's very disturbing. And when you read down through that document, they think that the sovereignty of the United States and all other countries should be subjugated to the United Nations, to one dictator. Jan, I've traveled around the world preaching, And you look at the leaders in the UN, and I'm going to be really blunt here. They come from corrupt countries.
Yes.
Where the political leaders sell out their countrymen. I mean, when aid is given by the United States to one of these countries, they pocket themselves and they watch their own people starve. They could care less. And then somehow they get placed on these various committees, or maybe they're the secretary of the UN even. And many of them are Marxists. Many of them, they're not committed to the safety of their own people in their own country, let alone the United States. And I don't understand how we have leaders in the United States who are willing to give up our sovereignty other than this. They've bought into the lie of the globalist agenda, which is a demonic ambition that Satan has to rule the world. Remember this, there is going to be a global governance that's going to be good. Jesus is going to be the one in control then. Any global governance between now and then other than Jesus is unhealthy for everyone. God, in Genesis chapter 11, created all the people groups, the nations. Acts chapter 17 says he gives every nation a boundary for a period of time, and he reigns supreme over all nations. So just know that the ambition of Satan is great, and we're looking forward to Jesus coming and his eternal state.
Alex Newman, you were present at this Pact for the Future, Summit of the Future. Did you sense the demonic? Was it palpable?
It's funny you ask that, Jan, because I always do when I go to these UN summits. You feel this darkness coming upon you when you go into these spaces, and that's been true when I go to these climate summits, and it was just as true when I got to the UN headquarters. You can feel that it is this wickedness that pervades the whole institution. In a way, it's frightening. I know we should fear only the Lord, and so I always try to keep that in mind as I'm in these places, but the agenda is so diabolical. When you read through the list of things the UN wants to do, beyond just overthrowing the nation state and creating a one-world dictatorship, the things they want for children, the things they want for education, the things they want for property rights, the things they want for family, it's just demonic. Plain and simple. I think the simplest way to understand the UN's agenda, whatever term they put on it, Green New Deal, Sustainable Development, New World Order, Build Back Better was one of the recent ones. Doesn't matter what marketing slogan they use. The real simple way to understand it is just take what God teaches in the Bible and flip it upside down, and what you'll see is that will line up with the UN's agenda all the time, even if sometimes it takes them a little while to come fully out of the closet and admit what they're really up to.
So do you think, Alex, that most of these people that you were rubbing shoulders with, this is back in late September, do you think they're mainly useful idiots? Or do you feel they know they are walking the trail of an agenda and they even know what that agenda is?
I think it's a mix. I think when you get to the very, very high levels, there is clear understanding that this is evil, that their commander-in-chief is Satan. And that sounds radical to non-Christians. I don't care. I think once you get up to the highest levels of the pyramid, if you will, these are people who have consciously, deliberately thrown in their lot with Satan and said, just like Karl Marx, I'm in league with Satan. I'm going to destroy everything that God has ordained. And of course, they will fail over the long term, but in the meantime, they're doing a lot of damage. And one way that you can see this so clearly, they have what they call a prayer, meditation, and reflection room at the UN. So you know about it. 99 out of 100 Americans have never heard of it. They wouldn't let me access it this time around. They said there was too many world leaders, but on normal days, we would have been able to access it. But this is a very bizarre place. I encourage people to read a little bit about it. One of the key players in designing and creating this thing was Alice Bailey. This is a lady who founded the Lucifer Publishing Company and claimed to be communicating with spiritual entities, clearly demons, that she called ascended masters, that told her about this glorious coming new age, that the big obstacle to this new age was what she called the great heresy of separateness. In other words, Christians and Jews who want to be holy because our God is holy, who want to come out of Babylon. We don't want to be part of this. We want to be separate. That's the obstacle to this new age, this new world order. So at the highest levels, these people understand exactly what they're doing.
I'm quoting you here because you write, only more globalism can handle the real and imagined problems facing humanity. According to the document, a recommitment to international cooperation based on respect for international law, the pact says is required, with international cooperation like multilateralism serving as a synonym for globalism. This is not an option but a necessity, it continues. In fact, the agreement specifically claims that nations and their governments cannot possibly handle the alleged problems that face humanity without the United Nations. Our challenges are deeply interconnected and far exceed the capacity of a single state alone. The pact states they can only be addressed collectively through strong and sustained international cooperation. Mark Henry, I think it's the hope of all of us that a more conservative president someday, should we have the time left, would pull out of the United Nations.
Yeah, when you look at the document again, it's amazing how they wordsmith things. Jan, again, I've got the document right in front of you there. When you skim down through it, if someone would just read the 10 points of Marxism, whether it's the education of the children and how you weaponize them, or the taxation and the taking away of property, or the control of communications and transportation, or the confiscation of property of all the rebels. In other words, you don't go along with the state. We weaponize the government to make sure that you live in poverty and go to the gulag. All they do in this document, Jan, is to take the 10 points of Marxism and wordsmith it in such a beautiful, articulate way so that the average person, if they read it, they would go, oh, that sounds really nice. But the bottom line is this: they have an agenda. These people understand what the agenda is. It's Marxism. And that's the reason we should have a president that stands up and says, this is the exact opposite of what a constitutional republic is. And we're going to lead the way. Those of you who would like to have a constitutional republic, follow us. This is the direction. This is the path of freedom. This Marxist UN movement is only going to lead to your bondage and your slavery, both spiritually and physically.
So, Alex, you're saying here, I'm quoting you, the real goal of the UN are the children. Okay, you've already referenced that a few minutes ago, but I think we need to unpack that for a minute or two, because that's a very, very serious statement, particularly in light of child trafficking, etc. Why is the goal of these globalists the children?
Well, I think the simple answer is they know that children are more pliable, and they understand what the Bible teaches. If you go to Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child in the way that he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. The scripture is filled with this. In Luke, Jesus actually says that a student is not above his teacher, but when he's fully trained, he's going to be like his teacher. So if you want to change the face of humanity, if you want to get people to abandon their religion, their values, the 10 Commandments, you've got to go for the children. We're the bitter clingers. They recognize that education is the key. That's not my opinion. They've said it over and over and over again in their agreements going back decades, and I could cite 10 just off the top of my head. They have a major global plan. They actually have what they call a world core curriculum. It was written by the guy they call the father of global education, Robert Mueller. He was a wackadoodle of the highest order. He actually called the UN one time the body of Christ, which we all know, of course, is blasphemy. The church is the body of Christ, not the United Nations. Really interesting. The foreword to the teacher's manual for the World Core Curriculum, which the UN says needs to be taught to every child in every school in every country, he admits that it's based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, who I mentioned earlier. So I bought her books to figure out kind of where they're going with this. She has one that she wrote in partnership with a demon. She called him the Tibetan, Jval Kul. They admit right there that brainwashing children to submit to one world government and even to have a one world brain is the critical element of bringing about this new age. So that's what the UN's working toward. They have a lot of other plans, but the central element of their agenda to bring about this diabolical one world system is brainwashing the next generation.
Next generation. So, Alex, who's going to head this one world system, the Pact for the Future? Is this the Secretary General of the United Nations? Is he going to head this, or are they appointing someone else?
The Secretary General, and Mark alluded to this, under Action Item 54, which I think is one of the most critical parts of this Pact for the Future, he would essentially become global dictator in the event of some kind of an emergency. As they say very clearly in there, it reads, and I can even quote it here, it says, "We recognize the need for a more coherent, cooperative, coordinated, and multidimensional international response to complex global shocks and the central role of the United Nations in this regard." It calls on the Secretary General, who's a socialist, by the way, in the truest sense of the term, to strengthen the United Nations system response to complex global shocks. And if you read the policy brief that was synthesized to create Action Item 54, they give the game away. They say that when the Secretary General, actually the Secretary General himself said, when he declares a global emergency, all sectors of society, government, business, nonprofit, religious, must, and I'm quoting here, recognize the primary role of intergovernmental organs, we're talking about UN agencies here, in decision-making. So he would become a key player, far beyond even what the UN Charter authorizes. But then again, back to the Pact for the Future. They agreed that all nations must comply with the decisions and uphold the mandate of the International Court of Justice, which is a kangaroo court. So they're setting up the mechanisms here to force the entire world to submit. And there'll be some distribution of power, but ultimately they'll all be walking in the same direction, which is against everything that God has told us.
So, Article 54 will make the UN the head of all governments and the leader of the UN the de facto dictator of the world. God's prophecy is so elegant, it's like looking at a finely made watch as it runs. We all know what that emergency is going to be. It will be the rapture. And when that happens, it will be the Antichrist that takes over the UN, which will then become the global government that this pact for the future dictates. Now, of course, this takes us to what I've talked about in previous podcasts. The UN being here in America is a problem. It will have to move to Europe. Now, Trump talked about this and made threats of pulling out and kicking out the UN in his first term. However, the biggest deterrent to doing this was, and still is, the fear of basically handing it over to China's influence. But a lot has changed since then.
Just looking back at the UN for a moment, we're seeing something of a shift in America. For almost the last 80 years, Americans have generally tolerated the UN. They've often even had a positive impression of the UN because they've been misled into thinking that this is an organization for peace, which you really need to understand that's peace in the Soviet sense, as in the elimination of all opposition to tyranny. But when you look at what's happening in America today, we see a huge shift. We have 26 U.S. governors on record just in the last few months saying they will not obey the United Nations when it comes to public health questions. They signed a public letter to Joe Biden. They said, look, the federal government doesn't have these powers under our Constitution. You certainly can't be delegating them to an international organization like the UN and the World Health Organization. So we're not going to obey. We have in Congress right now, in the House and the Senate, for the first time, matching bills to get us out of the United Nations. It's called the Defund Act, which the name is a little misleading because it does much more than defund, but it's about getting us out of the United Nations. It would completely sever our ties. Our troops would no longer serve under UN command with those blue helmets. We would evict their headquarters from our shores. And we've had bills like that in the House. We've had occasional movement in the Senate, but never matching bills. And obviously Joe Biden and his handlers would never sign something like that. But when Donald Trump comes in, he made globalism one of the top targets of his first administration. He's been clear that he's going to do that again. So I think the UN is at the very least going to take a real beating. And I think we should celebrate that as Christians. I think we should encourage that, but ultimately recognizing that our hope is not in politics.
Amen.
It's not in Donald Trump. It's got to be in Jesus Christ. We've got to be focused on him, and we've got to be focused on doing the things that he called us to do. We can't just sit back and say, oh, great, we have a decent president again. Let's go back to watching our football. No. God's given us clear commands. We've got the Great Commission. We've got the training and the discipling of our own children. We've got lost people who are facing a potential eternity in hell separated from God. How can we rest? How can we relax when we know that's what's going on? So we've got to redouble our efforts to reach the lost, to proclaim the gospel to the lost. And there's never been a better time than right now.
There is both political will and popular support now for a move like this. But I still think there would need to be a reason, because this is no small move. Now, I'm not saying this is how it's going to play out, but I do think it's more likely than not this is what's coming. It's really starting to look like the UN will kick Israel out. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for both Netanyahu and Israel's former defense minister Gallant. That alone is something worthy of its own podcast. But how much longer do you think it will be before the UN follows suit? When that happens, and it is coming, look for Trump to remove all of our funding from the UN. At that point, the UN will either leave in anger or be kicked out of the US by Trump. Another possible scenario is that the UN kicks out Israel as a result of Isaiah 17. We don't know how long the gap between Isaiah 17 and the events of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is. I tend to think it will not be as a result of Isaiah 17, but I do put that out there as a possibility because it certainly is. There is one last thing I do want to mention. After the rapture, the Antichrist will take over the UN and declare the emergency, Article 54, that makes him dictator and the UN head of all governments. The Bible and anything truly biblical will be outlawed as the very first act of this new global government.
Brandon, before we went on, we talked a little bit about the Summit of the Future. I was actually there. I went to cover it as a correspondent for the New American Magazine. Yeah. And the final agreement, the Pact for the Future, one of the most frequently discussed topics is the need for the UN and governments around the world to crack down on misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And just a quick word about hate speech before giving the details. That's actually a term that the Soviet Union came up with back in the 1970s. It was the Soviets who introduced that into the UN lexicon. And it doesn't mean what you think it means, people. It doesn't mean hating homosexuals or immigrants or any of those things that they want you to think. It really is a label that they believe should be applied primarily to Christians, people who believe what God said about marriage, people who believe what God said about gender, people who believe what God said about any important topic, and ultimately people who believe the gospel, people who believe that Jesus Christ can transform us and that we don't have to be stuck in our sin. Sin is not our identity. You can be transformed. That's hate speech. So eventually, if these people aren't stopped, they fully intend to criminalize the gospel.
These events aren't just going to happen. They are in the process of happening right now. As I've stated before, we are in a free fall to tribulation. These are amazing times we live in, but don't let anything take your focus off of Jesus. Don't let the rapture surprise you. Lay up treasure in heaven while you still have time to.